Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Last week, the Federal Bureau of Investigation released its annual Hate Crime Statistics Act report, a compilation of statistics related to bias-motivated incidents throughout the nation. Joining us today for a bipartisan conversation on how states plan to respond to the recently released FBI report and to discuss ways in which states plan to aid law enforcement authorities in the investigation of possible hate crimes are New York State Attorney General Letitia James and Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost. Moderating this conversation is Melanie Marin-Pell, AJC Managing Director of Regional Offices. After we hear from Melanie and our esteemed guests, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that's questions plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Melanie, I now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you to our special guest today. And I bring special greetings to you, Attorney General James, from our 3 regional offices in New York, AJC Westchester Fairfield, and AJC Long Island. And to you, Attorney General Yost, I bring special greetings from AJC Cincinnati and AJC Cleveland. So we are well represented in both of your states. So to start us off, I'd like to invite each of you to give us some very brief opening thoughts before I pose some questions to you. And Attorney General James, why don't you get us started?
Thank you so much, Melanie and Daniel. And I also want to thank the AJC for convening us here today on this most important topic, a topic that I have focused on for at least 10 years. As you know, I am a former member of the City Council and I represent part of the Orthodox community. And I consider myself an honorary member of the Orthodox community, having represented Crown Heights for 10 years. And again, for 10 years, we enjoyed any major incident in Crown Heights under my leadership. I want to acknowledge my colleague, Attorney General David Yost. There is much more that binds us, as we know, as a nation and as a society than that which separates us. And I am so grateful to be a part of this important conversation with all of you today. The discussion comes at a critical time in our history. We find ourselves battling this pandemic and systemic inequalities and inequities. And Americans, unfortunately, find ourselves more divided than we've been in some time. And most people are victims of bias-fueled acts of hate. And according to the recent report in a recent article in the New York Times, hate in the United States has risen, unfortunately, to its highest level in more than a decade. And the sharp increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes is cause for serious concern for all individuals who care about one another, to recognize that all of us are inextricably tied to one another. The prejudice even evades some corners of mainstream politics, unfortunately, as well as the web. And it's reminiscent of times past. We cannot allow these actions to be the new normal. Freedom of speech must never be confused with the freedom to incite violence and hatred. We face a time when intolerance appears to be more common than acceptance and love. And love has grown, and hate, unfortunately, has grown louder than love. And love is our common denominator. We must continue to hold ourselves and one another accountable to living up to the expectations of inclusion and compassion, and of course, to the tenets of our faith. And as everyone knows, that I am a woman of great faith and continue to preach about love and acceptance of all of us in this society. In our personal lives, we cannot allow microaggressions or ignorance to go unchallenged. And we must demand that of our leaders as well. And all of us must speak out against hate, which is why whenever there is an act of hate in New York City in particular, but also all across the state of New York and this country, it is a quick response from all of us, Black, white, Latino, Asian, Muslim. It really doesn't matter. All of us must quickly respond. And for my part, I strive to use the powers of my office to fight against policies rooted in xenophobia or anti-Semitism or any type of ism or any type of hate. Toward this end, as most of you know, I've created a hate crimes task force and a hotline in the Office of Attorney General, so that communities who are victims of hate crimes know that they can turn to us. This was especially poignant when during the COVID-19, when there were acts of hate against the Asian community, when my Asian brothers and sisters were the target of some really atrocious vitriol and harassment and some attacks by some leaders. As most of you know, I've also formed a Jewish Black Alliance where we meet periodically to talk about ways that we could work together to address the issue of hate. I think it's important that we stay aware that hate can manifest in other ways too, like in discriminatory anti-Semitic housing policies, zoning codes and decisions. In fact, we are engaged in a legal proceeding against a town in New York for precisely this reason. We are also investigated a local car dealership for discriminating against customers over fears that the Jewish community was spreading the coronavirus. The rise of hate crimes and anti-Semitism should concern all of us, and we all must work to stem the deep, troubling tide that we find ourselves in. Let us do so by focusing on the values and qualities that unite us, our shared humanity, our shared unity, our focus on love, acceptance, justice, and most importantly, on hope, never-ending hope. And I, of course, obviously look forward to the conversation here today and whatever I personally and or my office can do to address this issue. I have continued to offer myself up as well as the New York State Office of Attorney General. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you've touched on so many important themes. And Attorney General Yost, I'd like to offer you also a chance to give some opening thoughts.
Thank you. And I too would like to thank AJC for hosting this incredibly timely and important discussion. General James noted that there are more things that unite us than divide us. And I think this is a great example. She and I have a similar worldview when it comes to hate and the crimes that follow it all too often. I will only add to her eloquent opening this observation. It's ironic, I think, that in this time, this moment, that we are seeing an increase in hate crimes. And the reason I say it's ironic is never have we had a more instant response to everything from racial slurs to actual criminal acts carried out with malice because of somebody's identity. The time that we live in, however, is increasingly less tolerant. And there's the irony. The cure for bad speech is to point out its badness. As Hugo Black said, the Supreme Court Justice, the cure for bad speech is more speech. And yet what we have seen is a knee-jerk reaction frequently to simply try to block even people from speaking. We're seeing hatred at people who have not the traditional kinds of indicia of hatred, but we're seeing people lumped in, for example, for partisan reasons and assumed that if you're of a Republican Party, you must all be racist. We need to have tolerance and inclusion and judge people individually, not as groups. And the idea of judging groups rather than individual acts, I think, is pernicious and actually decreases our ability to effectively combat hate. But General James and I share this commitment to use our offices and the microphones that we each temporarily possess to push back, to speak the truth, to advocate for love, and where there is not appropriate for love, and there are evil people in the world, at least that we should act with dignity and respect, even toward those who act evilly.
Thank you so much. And again, I want to thank both of you for those opening remarks, because what you have both just said really embodies so much of what AJC is trying to do, and why we value so much the ability to have bipartisan conversations like this, because we know we may not all agree with everyone all the time. Our CEO, David Harris, likes to say, we don't want to also just be tolerated. We want to be respected. So we should strive for even more than just tolerance, but we need to listen to one another in order to really understand and respect one another. So if we can dive into some of the questions we have today. As was mentioned at the beginning, last week, the FBI released its 2019 hate crimes data. And once again, despite being less than 2% of the population, Jews were by far the most targeted group for religiously motivated hate crimes, with 60% of those hate crimes targeted against the Jewish community. We were second overall after Black Americans in terms of hate crimes, and saw one of the two largest increases in hate crimes against us in 2019. So at a time when we see the FBI data shows that hate crimes are rising. In addition, AJC also released its own survey of American Jewish opinion on anti-Semitism just a few weeks ago. In our survey, 88% of Jews believe anti-Semitism is a problem in the US. The FBI data validated our concerns. So again, I'm going to turn to you first, Attorney General Yost, and ask you, what would your message be to the Jewish community?
My message would be: don't give up, don't give in. I've talked with members of the Jewish community who have declined to report things because they feel nothing's ever going to happen, and or if something did happen, if somebody was arrested, that the jury would never convict them. First of all, we live in the real world. That's a possibility. There are times that a bad person that's guilty of the thing that they're charged with is acquitted by a jury. But that's not a reason not to bring it. Look, you're going to lose every case you don't charge. The jury's going to go against every case that's not brought. And those cases are only going to happen when people stand up. Listen to General James Day, listen to me, listen to the other people in law enforcement. We want to know. We don't tolerate crimes of any sort, but especially not hate crimes. We need you to help us, though. If we don't know the crime exists, if we don't know what happened, if we don't have a complaining witness, how are we ever going to be able to mount proof beyond a reasonable doubt and bring that person to justice? The fact that justice might fail in a case does not obscure the fact that justice prevails most of the time, most of the places in America.
Thank you. And Attorney General James, you noted your really remarkable and important work, for which we are so grateful, with the Jewish and Black Alliance. And we know that in some of your conversations with AJC, this has been discussed, the fact that there are many, as Attorney General Yost said, certainly in the ultra-Orthodox community, who have they've almost come to almost a normalization of anti-Semitism against them. And so they don't report, because they say, well, nothing's going to happen, just as Attorney General Yost said. So we see this resignation, even from within the community sometimes, in the fight against anti-Semitism, which is extremely concerning. So what would your message be to those who don't report because of perceptions that nothing really will come of it?
So we know that this data, unfortunately, severely undercounts the number of hate crimes. And we also know that state localities and local localities are not required to report a lot of these hate crimes to the FBI. And then last, let me just say, here in New York City in particular, and perhaps all throughout the state of New York, there have been some challenges to local authorities, and particularly members of law enforcement, with respect to whether or not they should designate certain crimes as hate crimes. And that has continued to be a challenge. So going forward, obviously, we've got to do a better job, particularly in the Orthodox community. And as you know, I'm very close to the Orthodox community, and we've got to inform them and educate them and encourage them with respect to reporting these crimes. It's so critically important. You know, I remember in the aftermath of the Tree of Life shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, where we all gathered together and we were all one. And we need to remember and hold on to that, particularly during these trying times. But it's important that we never, ever, ever shy away from standing with one another and continue to educate the general public, as well as the Orthodox community, which tends to be insular, but nonetheless is very welcoming, about the importance of reporting hate crimes and standing together whenever there is a hate crime.
Thank you. Attorney General Yost, we've talked a little bit about reporting and some of the challenges to reporting. We also want the agencies that collect data to report it back to the FBI. However, we know that the more data we collect and the more we report, the more likelihood we'll see a rise in the number of hate crimes. So can you share any insights that you might have based on your vantage point about, are we seeing a real rise in hate crimes, or are we just learning more about the incidents because there is more reporting?
Well, it's probably some of both. And, you know, it's not just about hate crimes. We have this problem across America in terms of collecting data about crimes that happen in the shadows. So sexual assaults have been, and I think continue to be, underreported. And human trafficking, and there's quite a few situations where the data mask the severity of the problem. As far as if we have more reporting, the data will show a rise. Look, we need to not be afraid of that. The data are what the data are. Don't be afraid to see what you see. Let's get the most accurate measurements that we can, and note that in the collection. If there's, you know, some kind of a asterisk that needs to go by the number because reporting dramatically increased, well, I think that would be a good thing. But the key here ultimately isn't data. Now, look, I spent 8 years of my life as the chief inspector of public offices in Ohio. I love data. I'm a data-driven guy. But when we're talking about hate crimes, that's measured one life at a time, one case file at a time. This doesn't happen to X number of people. It happens to one person, a person who is frequently mortified, maybe cowering in fear, someone who's going to carry that trauma with them the rest of their lives, maybe physical and economic injuries. It changes you forever. The measurement of this is a qualitative measurement. It's one human being and the impact on that life. So I have to tell you, as much as I care about the data, it's not the numbers that move me. It's the stories, it's the narratives, it's the impact that I see, one life at a time.
Thank you. And Attorney General James, is there anything you'd like to add on to what Attorney General Yost just said?
Listen, the data indicates that there has been a sharp increase in hate crimes against Jews and against Latinos, and the number one target, unfortunately, in our nation are Blacks. And so all of us need to join together: white, Black, Latino, Asian, Jewish, Christian, Muslim. It really doesn't matter. All of us must stand together to stamp out hate, to talk about love, to talk about unity, to talk about our commonality, to talk about our shared values, and to talk about uniting this nation going forward. It's really critically important. And as leaders, words matter. And so it's important that every leader in this nation, and you don't necessarily have to be an elected official to be a leader, it's important that everyone understand that words matter. And so we really need to be circumspect about what comes out of our mouth and think before we talk.
Thank you. And Attorney General Yost, I want to pick back up on something that you said in your opening remarks about free speech. So obviously, most speech is protected, and people are certainly free to think terrible things if they so choose, which is why hate crime statutes require an underlying act that can be shown to be motivated by hate or bias. And we know some of the FBI data distinguishes between incidents and offenses because there are times people are on the receiving end of hateful behavior, even if a crime hasn't been committed. So should those be reported to you or to the police? What is the role of law enforcement here? And can you comment on the importance of this distinction between incidents and offenses?
Thank you. Obviously, an incident is any hate-based act that, including speech, that does not rise to a crime. And frankly, I don't see any free speech or freedom of association or freedom of thought objection to collecting that data. The understanding the prevalence of hateful behavior and hateful thinking and speech is an important thing for us to all push back against. Now, a crime obviously is a crime, and the hate element is an enhancer, in my view, just as though there's a difference between someone who steals because their family is starving versus someone who steals out of greed. We would all agree that although both of those are theft offenses, what ought to happen to the thief is dramatically different. So an assault is an assault. An assault for hate is something that ought to be treated more seriously. Now, to take that one step further, what is the role of the Attorney General's office in any state when we have a non-criminal act? What can you do? Government has a monopoly on the use of force, and I don't think it's appropriate to use that against merely speech, merely hateful behaviors that don't rise to a level of the crime. However, the government does have an interest, just as it's appropriate to collect that data on hateful incidents. It's also not only appropriate, but incumbent, a duty of an attorney general to speak up and to denounce hatred, not just in the sense of that's bad, but to explain why it's bad, to debunk where there's false information, to tell the truth, to use that big microphone that comes with the office to set the record straight. And I know that General James, one of the things I admire about her greatly is her very skillful use of that microphone to advocate for justice.
Thank you. And Attorney General James, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I just want to thank General Yost for that compliment. And I too want to join and thank him, obviously, for his insight, for his experience, and for his assistance in my transitioning to this office in the last 2 years. But I also want to say, as he indicated, freedom of speech must never be tolerated and must never be confused. I should say must never be confused with the freedom to incite violence and hatred. And there's a lot of, I specifically want to talk about the dark web. And I specifically want to talk about 230 of the Communications Decency Act, basically which basically says that no provider of an interactive computer service shall be treated as a publisher or speaker of any information provided by another. So Section 230 basically provides immunity to a number of platforms. And one of the things that I join with my Republican colleagues all across this nation in efforts to to revise Section 230, because individuals obviously need to be accountable for the misinformation and the disinformation, as well as individuals who go on the dark web and incite violence. And that's a tool that we really need to have at our disposal to go after some of these organizations who incite violence and hatred against other groups in our nation. I know that a number of internet providers are fighting back against this, again, using the First Amendment. But again, the First Amendment should never be used as an excuse to incite hatred and violence. And so I look forward to working with my Republican colleagues, because this is not a political issue. This is an issue of humanity, an issue where we should send a strong message across this nation that as Americans, we will not tolerate hate and or violence against any group simply because they are different. As you mentioned, it's about respect and dignity for all.
Thank you. I want to pick up on something that you didn't say, but that I think we can make a leap, and that is to talk a bit about the threat posed by white supremacist groups. And we know that they can lurk both in dark places like the dark web, or very openly in very public ways. But we know also from a Department of Homeland Security report from last month that found that 81% of what could be constituted as extremist homicides in 2019 were perpetrated by white supremacists and came from white supremacist groups. So we know also that these groups are forming hubs across the country and that their numbers are increasing. And I'm interested to know first from you, Attorney General James, and then from you, Attorney General Yost, about how you're addressing the threat posed by white supremacist groups in your states.
So we have a hate crimes task force, and we are looking at these white supremacist groups and terrorist groups, which pose a threat to our sovereignty, not only to the state of New York, but to our nation as a whole. And so we are working with organizations across this nation, taking leadership from them, but also looking at history and how in the past, particularly during the civil rights movement, some groups, such as the Southern Poverty Law Center, was successful in taking down some of these hate groups. We want to take a page out of their playbook and begin to, again, engage in investigation, and continue to investigate some of these hate groups, which unfortunately lurk behind the dark web and are, as you indicated, openly violating the rights of others in the state of New York. And again, my message is clear: hate will not be tolerated in the state of New York, and I will use every power at my disposal to shut them down and to bankrupt them. And we need to send a strong message, and we need to do it together.
Thank you. And Attorney General Yost, again, we know that we can't legislate people's feelings or their beliefs, and yet the threat posed by these groups is real and can often very quickly go from just thoughts to actions that are extremely problematic. So I'm interested in Ohio. What are you seeing?
Well, Ohio is much like the rest of America. I want to go back to something that General James said that I don't think can be overestimated or overstated, and that's the importance of the immunity of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, kind of ironically named when we think about some of the things that are said at this point. There isn't, or I should say, there's way too much indecency out there, but Section 230 provides a cover for the amplification of these things. And while you're free to speak, these platforms provide geometric, logarithmic amplification of these horrible ideas, and that is a creation of law. That is that's an immunity that didn't occur prior to 1996. And so I think it's well past time to do that. Now, it's to revisit Section 230. With regards to what's going in Ohio and what are we doing, I'm an old prosecutor. I came up through the ranks on that side of the office. And all I'm willing to say is that we're well aware of this, that there is substantial intelligence gathering and planning activities. And I'm not going to tip my hand to those folks. But once you move from words to actions, you can count on law enforcement, not just in Ohio, but across this country, being united. Let me, against you, let me add one other thing. General James has referred to her faith several times. I am a professing and attempting to practice Christian. And if we have anybody that identifies as a white supremacist out there, I want to say this to you, particularly with regards to your hatred of Jews, but white supremacy completely is anti-Christian. It is anti-Christ. You cannot make that case out of our scriptures. And I want to make it very clear that I denounce it.
Thank you.
Let me just
Oh,
say
go ahead.
let me just say to AG Yost, amen.
I'll add my own amen there too. No, we really appreciate it. It's so important to hear. And, you know, one of the challenges we have in confronting anti-Semitism is that it takes many forms. We know that it can be very sort of, if we want to call it traditional forms, where people paint swastikas somewhere, you know, anti-Semitic slurs, but there are a lot of other less easily recognizable sources that, you know, we're trying to help educate people about. AJC has really been working hard on this, and we feel that it's an important component of law enforcement training so that they can understand the many permutations and the shape shifting that anti-Semitism is capable of. It's one of the reasons why AJC has been a leading advocate for the No Hate Act, which is federal legislation that would provide grants to states to enhance their ability to train law enforcement and also collect data on hate crimes. But I'm interested to know how your states train law enforcement to recognize bias crimes when, in fact, you know, we know with anti-Semitism, for example, it can take many forms. So what are some of the ways in which you're working with law enforcement to help them understand when they're seeing something that could be constituted as a crime of bias or a hate crime? And Attorney General James, I'll start with you.
So the governor of the state of New York, Governor Cuomo, again, has urged state police and all authorities throughout the state of New York to engage in training on hate crimes. Is it enough? No. Should it be more specific and more thorough? Yes. It's really critically important that we train our state police and our local authorities with respect to identifying hate crimes in all the forms that it manifests. And in addition to the white nationalist groups that unfortunately we find themselves in the state of New York.
And how about for Ohio?
So obviously training in hate crimes is part of the academy that you go through. And the federal act that you mentioned would be a great step forward because it'll provide resources to local communities toward that end, to train toward the recognition and to encourage the reporting of hate crimes.
Thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't offer to both of you that AJC would welcome the opportunity. We can also provide training to you and your colleagues in your offices on how to identify anti-Semitism and how to understand the many permutations of anti-Semitism. So I have a couple of more questions, and then we'll turn it back to Daniel for some questions from our viewers. But I'd like to ask, we're in a moment where we can all, I think, recognize that we need to do some repairing and rebuilding of the trust between police and communities that they serve. And I'm interested, again, from your vantage point, what do you see? What do you see as ways that those relationships can be repaired, rebuilt, restored, renewed? And I'll start with you, Attorney General James.
So it's important that we continue to repair the breach and heal the wounds and bind our wounds here, not only in New York, but all across our nation as a result of systemic inequalities. And so community policing is obviously very, very key. And so we're trying to get back at community policing. Diversifying our police force is obviously very critically important. Training is essential as well. And I joined with Attorney General Yost. Those grants will go a long way in assisting the police and law enforcement all throughout our nation. And it's important that individuals, that we democratize the police, and as well as have a police force that is transparent. And that is what is critically important. In New York City, the police department is engaging in listening sessions with residents of with residents of the city of New York, particularly focusing on communities of color. And what we are trying to do is, again, heal the breach. As you know, the governor of the state of New York has tasked me with the responsibility of investigating the police in the aftermath of several protests. We've issued a preliminary report, and we will issue a final report, and we will engage in conversations with our police commissioner, as well as with the mayor of the city of New York and other jurisdictions all throughout the state of New York. But it's important that we prevent as many any civilian fatalities at the hands of police, and that we do all that we can do to remove from the police or train them, particularly in the area of mental illness. Police officers are just not equipped to deal with individuals who are suffering from mental illness. It's important that we have mental health professionals respond to incidents of individuals who are decompensating. That is so critically important in all of the cases that I've been involved in, particularly in cases involving civilian fatalities at the hands of police. A significant number of them have been individuals who are suffering from mental illness.
Thank you. And Attorney General Yost, I'd like to give you a chance to answer that question. And then also following that, if you can also add, what can organizations like AJC do to just help? How can we be of help?
I appreciate that. The things that General James has described are common to law enforcement across the country. Our response to the mentally ill in this country has been a travesty, and relying on law enforcement to be the backstop, while maybe that's better than nothing, is certainly inadequate. Look, I want to respond to something. I don't think that General James meant this in the way that I'm going to caution about it, but I'm very concerned about the popular discussion about, and she used the phrase, democratizing law enforcement. The notion of law enforcement being a tool of the popular will frightens me. And I think it should frighten every American who knows anything about history. The Holocaust itself, the things that happened in Nazi Germany, were popularly supported. Law enforcement famously looked by while lynchings occurred in the South. Why? Because it was popularly supported. Law enforcement needs to be, and I think this is what General James was talking about. Law enforcement needs to recognize that it is not an occupying force, that it is a servant to the community that they patrol. And I think largely they do. But I'm really concerned that in our rush to make policing more responsive in some communities, that we risk unleashing the genie from the bottle. Law enforcement has to be restricted by the rule of law, not the popular will. The role of the popular will is to enact the laws within the confines of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that it can muster through its elected representatives. Law enforcement needs to only be enforcing those laws, not responding to the popular will. And I worry about where we're going in this country a little bit with some of the things that I've seen. The last thing I'll mention, what can AJC do? Obviously, doing things like this, advocacy, raising awareness is critically important. But I think it's also important to point out the soft bigotry that is, that's a harsh word, because I don't mean to condemn anybody, but I'd like to think for a moment about recent comments by the mayor in New York City. And I'm not condemning him as an individual. I'm hoping this is a coachable moment. He talks about, or had talked about and singled out Orthodox Jewish communities for COVID enforcement in ways that he didn't look at for the protests that were in the streets, or for that matter, the benefit for Breonna Taylor, the concert that occurred, or for that matter, the Islamic festivals that were observed by crowds of thousands. And I think that when politicians don't think carefully about how they are describing a particular thing, and certainly the Orthodox gatherings represented a threat for COVID transmission. But when you single out a particular group and other similarly situated groups are not called out, I think you're really sending a subtle message that helps to create a fertile seedbed for anti-Semitism or for racism or what have you. It's important that we speak objectively and we treat and talk about groups that are similarly situated in the same way. And AJC has been fearless about speaking out, and I think it's so important that it continues to educate that those kind of implicit biases occur in our governing class and need to be carefully thought about, particularly as something like this, where the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages was blamed on Jews. There's an ancient echo here that I'm concerned about.
Thank you for raising that. It was concerning to us as well. And Attorney General James, I'd like to give you a chance to respond, react, just add anything you'd like.
Yeah, so, I'm not here to defend Mayor de Blasio, but what I'm here to do is defend the Constitution and the rule of law. And it's important that whether it's the police or whether it's comments of elected officials, that everyone be treated equally and that we enforce equal justice for all. And the democratization of the police department includes, my reference to it underscores that point. It's equal justice under the law. And the video cameras, the body cameras, and I, as you know, was at the forefront of body cameras for law enforcement in the city of New York. It objectifies street encounters, and some of the body cameras cause concern amongst all New Yorkers, which is why there was this outpouring of individuals on the streets of New York City. And again, it's really about ensuring that the constitutional rights, the human rights and the civil rights of all individuals are respected by everyone. And that apply, and that again, I guess basically further gives explanation as to the term democratizing the police department. We're at a point in our nation where individuals are struggling with some of the hashtags that have been used And perhaps we should get away from hashtags. And perhaps what we should really be talking about is the rule of law and the laws that protect all of us, and particularly the Constitution in our country, and that they be that the Constitution and those rights be enforced fairly, evenly, and without discrimination, and that we not focus or target any particular group or single out any particular group, that it applies to all of us. And that also includes, again, the enforcement of law by our much respected members of law enforcement who put their lives on the line each and every day for us. But again, what we are seeing as evidence in some of these body cameras has been troubling.
Thank you. You know, I think everyone listening, I hope, can appreciate the incredible work that both of you have to do to really understand and balance so many different interests and needs while prioritizing upholding the Constitution first and foremost. So we're certainly grateful. I'd like to turn it for just a few final moments to Daniel for a few questions from our viewers, and then we'll wrap up in a few moments.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. Our first question comes from Stephanie Barrand, the regional president of the AJC Westchester Fairfield office. Attorney General James, thank you very much for your close partnership with AJC Westchester Fairfield over many years. How can private citizens themselves best contribute to hate crimes reporting and your work combating hate crimes?
So obviously they can work with us on our task force, and they can report any incidents to our hate crimes hotline, as well as work with our task force. And then again, hopefully join with me in urging that this federal law be passed, that we get additional grants to our law enforcement, that we do a better job of training law enforcement, and that we reach out again to the Orthodox community and others. And it's not just the Orthodox community. There's several groups in the Latino community, in the African-American community, in the Asian American community, in the Muslim community that unfortunately do not report crimes. It's unfortunate that they continue to accept this notion that they should be victims of hate crime. And I'm here to say that no one should be victimized by hate crimes, and that all of us should raise our voices and report them to local law enforcement, as well as to the FBI, so they could be properly reported, and that all of us can live with dignity and respect without fear of being attacked because of our religion, because of who we love, and because of what we look like.
Thank you. Attorney General Yost, our next question comes from Andrew Marks on Zoom, who asks, what concrete steps would you like to see the federal government take to support your efforts at the state level to combat hate crimes?
I'd like to see the Hate Act passed and funded. I think that would be useful. In addition to that, though, I think that it's important for this not to be a localized issue. We need national voices to speak up. I remember clearly reading about the 1950s and 60s and the civil rights movement, and ultimately people like Representative McCullough, as well as the activists like John Lewis and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who spoke up on a national stage to say, this is what America's about. It's important to not just be a localized effort, although all such things are necessarily local, but that we have national leaders who are weaving these values into the fabric of our national identity, what it means to be an American.
Thank
Daniel,
you.
before you jump in, I just want to say to anyone watching, you can go to ajc.org/no-hate and fill out our action alert to contact your senators to urge them to support the No Hate Act, which is now part of the HEROES Act. Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. Our next question comes from Stephen Miller on Zoom. This is for you, Attorney General James. Can you discuss discrimination against students at universities, such as NYU or others, and what is being done to protect those students from discrimination and intimidation?
So there is a law in the state of New York to protect students and others in regards to hate. And if in fact there are any specific incidences at any universities, including at NYU, please reach out to my office. We will look into them. We will investigate those matters. Again, my hate crimes task force, 1-800-771-7755, 1-800-771-7755. Please reach out to our office with respect to any specific complaints that you have or instances. Our office will fully investigate them. We have investigators and advocates and attorneys on the call right now, on the phone right now.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question, which I'll address to both of you, and perhaps Attorney General Yost, you can answer first. This is from Tori Fish in San Francisco, California. The beginning of this conversation was truly inspiring. Hearing both of you speak about what you have in common from a policy perspective was incredibly refreshing. As polarization in politics gets uglier, are attorneys general in general as bipartisan as the two of you are? And is this the last, are the attorneys general the last holdouts of bipartisanship?
Well, I don't know that I would hold up attorneys general as the paragon of bipartisanship. We have disagreements between some of the blue state AGs and some of the red state AGs. But what binds us together is a sense of what America's about, our commitment to the rule of law. And because of that, we speak a common language. There are things that we, and Tish and I, General James and I, will never agree on. We see the world differently. We have different preferences about what the best route forward is. But what unites us is an understanding that we are not a country that's run by individual opinion. We are a country that's run by the rule of law, and that the law should be the same, mean the same thing, same rules for everybody. One of my favorite fiction authors that I don't get to read very often anymore is Michael Connelly, whose fictional detective Harry Bosch has a saying that I bet General James agrees with. Either everybody counts or nobody counts.
I join with you, and I noticed that the Attorney General has a book in his background entitled Ike. And I can recall that President Eisenhower once said that the fire of bigotry cannot be ignored. And so although we may disagree on some issues, I'd rather focus on that which brings us together. And Attorney General Yost and I and others on a bipartisan fashion are focusing on the scourge of opioids, which have unfortunately killed too many Americans and unfortunately is exacerbated by this pandemic. Vaping, which unfortunately too many of our young children have been addicted to smoking, and these vaping companies have taken a page out of big tobacco. We've worked together on antitrust issues, on big tech. We worked together on consumer fraud issues, particularly these annoying robocalls that too many seniors get, and that I call them bottom feeders, prey upon these vulnerable seniors, stealing their money. We worked together on financial crimes in the financial industry. And so we've worked on quite a bit. And although we are not, as was mentioned, individuals who are the paradigm of bipartisan, we've worked on quite a bit of cases together, again, in unison, in unity, recognizing that we've got a responsibility and a mission to uphold the law and to work on behalf of all Americans, regardless of their political affiliation and whether or not they voted for us or not. And so I check my politics at the door. And for me, it's really all about the rule of law and making sure that everyone is respected, and that we enforce the law evenly and fairly, regardless of your political affiliation, your race, your religion, or your sexual orientation, and knowing that we are all part of one human family. I thank you so much.
Melanie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to both of you. I think it really has been an inspiring conversation and a really important one for all of us and for all of our viewers. I know that on behalf of AJC, we're deeply grateful to each of you. We look forward to working with you and your offices individually and collectively with other attorneys general wherever we can. And certainly look forward to continuing our effort to combat hate crimes, to strengthen hate crimes reporting, and to build a society where people respect one another, listen to one another, and engage in civil conversations so effectively like we have done here today. So thanks to all of our viewers and thanks to both of you.
Everyone have a happy holiday and God bless
Happy
you.
Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Enjoy.
Thank you all. Have a great day. Goodbye.
Bye.